The noon sun beat down on Silver Creek, baking the dust of its single street into a fine pale powder. In Wyoming territory, silence was a currency, but today it was broken by the splintering crack of a gunshot from the First Territorial Bank. Men dove for cover behind water troughs and horse rails. Women pulled children into the dusty sanctuary of the general store. From his office, Deputy Sheriff Mason Hayes was on his feet, before the echo dyed his hand, already on the worn grip of his Colt. He moved not with the hurried panic of the townsfolk, but with a grim, practiced economy of motion that spoke of a man long accustomed to violence. 5 years. 5 years he had worn the star, not out of ambition, but as a penance. It was a way to impose order on a world that had shown him only chaos, a way to protect other families from the kind of loss that had hollowed out his own. A second shot rang out as a wiry man in a dusty coat burst from the bank, a heavy canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He fired wildly into the air, his eyes wide with a mixture of greed and terror. "Stay back. I ain't afraid to use this." Mason stepped into the street, his tall frame a stark silhouette against the glare. He didn't draw his weapon. Not yet. "Drop the bag, son." He set his voice a low, steady rumble that carried over the sudden quiet. "Nobody else has to get hurt." The robber, a young man no older than 20, hesitated. His gaze darted from Mason to the growing crowd of onlookers peeking from doorways. "Don't you come no closer, deputy, I mean it." "I know you do," Mason said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "But look around. There's nowhere to run. You shot the teller, but you didn't kill him. Don't make it worse." Panic was winning. The young man's gun hand trembled. He took a half step back, then another, his eyes searching for an escape that didn't exist. It was then that Mason saw it dangling from a chain hooked to the man's vest. A silver pocket watch, ornate and unique, its lid chased with the image of a wolf howling at the moon. The world seemed to slow the sounds of the street, fading to a dull roar in Mason's ears. The sun glinted off the silver, a flash of impossible memory. He had seen that watch 1,000 times, held it in his own hands as a boy. It had belonged to his father. And it had been in his sister Rachel's pocket the night she died, a keepsake she always carried for luck. It was supposed to be buried with her, lost in the fire and rock of the Whispering Pines mine. The sight of it broke through his practiced calm. The blood drained from his face, replaced by an icy resolve. "Where?" he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Did you get that watch?" The question, so strange and specific, rattled the young robber. "What I don't—" "The watch." Mason repeated, his hand now resting on the butt of his Colt. "Tell me." The robber saw the shift in the deputy's eyes, the professional detachment replaced by something raw and personal. He panicked, raising his pistol. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Mason's draw was a blur of motion, a single fluid act of muscle and memory. His Colt barked once. The robber cried out, clutching his shoulder as he stumbled backward, the gun clattering to the dust. The canvas bag of money fell, spilling coins that rolled and spun in the dirt. But Mason's eyes were fixed on the silver watch, which had been jarred loose and now lay gleaming in the middle of the street. As the townsfolk cautiously emerged, as Dr. Wilson rushed to the wounded man, Mason walked forward, his gaze locked on the small silver object. He knelt, his calloused fingers closing around the cool metal. He thumbed the release. The lid snapped open, revealing the familiar white face and the faint hairline crack across the number 7. Inside the lid, the tiny hand-scratched inscription was still there. "For William Hayes. May you always find your way home. Love, Mary." A ghost from a buried past now lying warm in his palm. The wounded robber groaned from the boardwalk where the doctor was tending to him. Got the job. From a fella in Laramie. He gasped out pain, making him talkative. Said Mercer Mining was hiring guards. Paid me half up front with this. He nodded toward the watch in Mason's hand. Said it was a bonus, a good luck charm. Mercer. The name was a venomous serpent coiling in Mason's gut. Joseph Mercer. The man who had bought the Whispering Pines mine for a pittance just days after the disaster. The man whose empire was built on a foundation of whispers and unanswered questions. For 5 years, Mason's grief had been a cold, quiet companion. He had sought answers hitting walls of silence and veiled threats at every turn. Now a silver pocket watch dropped by a clumsy bank robber had just given him a key. This was no longer just about the past. The past had just reached out and fired a gun in the middle of his town. Holding the watch that should have been buried with his sister Mason Hayes felt a 5-year-old promise harden into a deadly certainty. The time for quiet questions was over. The Pine Ridge Ranch was a testament to one man's war against chaos. Mason's home stood in the center of a valley carved by the Little Laramie River, its log walls solid and square, its stone chimney breathing a steady plume of smoke into the crisp autumn air. Every fence post was straight, every gate latched, every tool in the barn hung in its proper place. It was an island of meticulous order in a world that had offered him none. This order was his armor, a defense against the memories that lurked just beyond the northern ridge, where the skeletal remains of the Whispering Pines mine scarred the landscape. He never looked at that ridge, if he could help it. Inside the house was just as disciplined. The floors were swept clean, the books on his shelves, histories, engineering manuals, volumes of poetry were arranged by size, and a single faded photograph of a laughing young woman, with his own dark eyes, stood on the mantelpiece. Rachel. He polished the frame every Sunday, a ritual as sacred as checking his fences. He was a man haunted not by ghosts, but by the sharp, tangible edges of their absence. Miles away in a different valley, another monument stood, but this one was a testament to power. The Mercer mansion commanded the valley, its imported stone walls catching the afternoon sun like a boast, each window a golden eye staring down at the lesser world below. It was less a home than a fortress, its manicured lawns and ornate fountains, a sterile declaration of wealth that felt both magnificent and lifeless. Inside, the air was cool and still smelling of lemon oil and the faint metallic scent of money. It was a gilded cage, and no one knew its bars better than Abigail Mercer. The inciting incident arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a letter on a silver tray. Mason, having traced the bank robber's hiring to a Mercer-owned freight company in Laramie, had spent a week crafting his next move. The watch was a direct link, but a fragile one. He needed a way inside the fortress, a way to observe, to listen. His proposal of marriage was a calculated gamble, a Trojan horse sent to the gates of his enemy. In the Mercer dining room, the letter's arrival shattered the strained silence. Joseph Mercer, a man whose presence filled any room he entered, broke the wax seal. At 58, he was still a formidable figure, his broad shoulders filling out his tailored suit, his neatly trimmed beard, unable to soften the hard set of his jaw. He read the letter, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "It seems," he announced, his steel-gray eyes, finding his youngest daughter, "that Mason Hayes is seeking a wife." Victoria, the eldest at 30, arched a perfectly shaped eyebrow. Her beauty was sharp and angular, like her ambition. The hermit of Pine Ridge. How droll. I thought he only socialized with his cattle. He owns half the northern valley. Sophia, the middle daughter, chimed in. Her voice was as sweet and cloying as honey, her eyes holding the cold calculation of a banker. She twisted the diamond on her finger, a gift from the governor's son. A very valuable half. He specifically inquires. Joseph continued his gaze, locking onto Abigail. About you. Abigail set her fork down her heart, giving a sudden, heavy thud. She was the family conscience, the quiet dissenter, the one who reviewed contracts for fraud and spoke for cheated farmers. She was a problem, and she knew with chilling certainty that her father had just been handed a solution. An advantageous match is a daughter's highest duty, Abigail, Joseph said later in his study. The words were not a suggestion, they were a verdict. His cruelty was never overt, never loud. It was insidious, couched in the language of patriarchal authority and familial obligation. You have been a source of difficulty. This is your chance to be a credit to this family. You will not fail in yours. Abigail stood before him, her hands clasped to stop their trembling. She was 23, and for most of her life, she had felt like a guest in her own home, a foreign conscience in a land of calculated self-interest. I have never met the man, Father. He has seen you, Joseph said dismissively. That is enough. The arrangements will be made. Her sister's reactions were just as telling. Finally putting that stubborn streak to good use, Victoria remarked later, her voice laced with condescending amusement. Perhaps a rustic life will suit you. Think of the connections, Abigail. Sophia gushed, though her eyes were already measuring the value of an alliance with the Hayes property. You could be quite useful for once. Abigail's response to them all was quiet, but firm, her steel will showing through carefully chosen words rather than an emotional outburst. I will do as Father wishes, she said, her calm unsettling them more than any argument would have. She saw the arrangement for what it was, an exile, but it was also an escape, and perhaps an opportunity. The name Hayes was linked in her memory to the Whispering Pines tragedy, a subject her father always steered conversations away from with uncharacteristic haste. If Mason Hayes was reaching into their family, he was not doing so blindly. Abigail decided she would go not as a pawn, but as her own player in a game she was only just beginning to understand. The carriage that brought Abigail to Pine Ridge felt more like a tumbril, taking her to her execution. She clutched a small bag containing a few simple dresses, her grandmother's book of medicinal herbs, and a secret leather-bound journal filled with notes on her father's questionable business dealings. When she finally stepped out into the yard of the ranch, Mason Hayes was waiting on the porch. He was taller than she remembered, his face carved by weather, and something deeper, a sorrow that had settled into the lines around his eyes. He was not handsome in the polished way of the city men her sisters courted, but there was a raw strength to him, a stillness that was both intimidating and compelling. Their first meeting was a tense chess match, played with polite greetings and watchful eyes. He was guarded, his questions about her journey and her family carefully neutral, but his gaze was sharp, analytical. He was testing her, trying to see if she was merely a spy for her father. Abigail, in turn, was wary, trying to discern his true motives. Why her? What did he hope to gain by marrying a mercer? Your father assured me you were practical, Mason said as he carried her single trunk into the house. It is his word for disobedient, she replied, her directness surprising him. The house was clean and sparse, dominated by a massive stone fireplace and a wall of books that spoke of a mind more complex than that of a simple rancher. It was a home built for solitude, not for sharing. Their fragile, unspoken truce was tested 2 days later. 2 men rode into the yard, in their city clothes and polished boots looking absurdly out of place. They claimed to be interested in buying cattle, but their eyes roamed over the ranch with a proprietary air lingering on Abigail as she stepped out onto the porch. Mason recognized their type instantly. Mercer's enforcers sent not to negotiate, but to intimidate. "We heard you had a guest, Hayes," the taller one said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Didn't take you for the marrying kind." Mason moved to stand beside Abigail, his posture relaxed but ready. "Times change," he said easily. "Abigail, these men are associates of your father." It was a critical moment. A flicker of fear, a step back, and their charade would crumble. But Abigail did not falter. She stepped forward slightly, a polite but cool smile on her face. "It's a pleasure to meet any friends of my father," she said, her voice betraying no anxiety. "Though I'm afraid Mason and I are quite busy planning our wedding. We simply don't have time for business today. Perhaps you could leave a message with my father's secretary when you return." Her calm dismissal, her use of Mason's first name, the easy way she implied a shared future, it was a masterful performance. The men exchanged a look, their assessment shifting. This wasn't the cowed, problematic daughter they'd likely been told about. This was a woman standing her ground, aligned with her future husband. "We'll do that, ma'am," the shorter man said, tipping his hat. They wheeled their horses around and rode off, their mission of intimidation a clear failure. When they were gone, the silence between Mason and Abigail was different. The tension of suspicion had been replaced by the hum of a shared victory. "You handled that well," Mason said, his voice holding a note of genuine respect. "I've had years of practice dealing with my father's associates." She replied, a faint wry smile touching her lips. "They're all bullies. The only thing they understand is a united front." In that moment, they were no longer just two individuals with secret agendas. They were a team. A fragile alliance had been forged in the face of a common enemy, and the first obstacle to their shared purpose had been overcome not with suspicion, but with trust. The investigation began in earnest, a quiet campaign waged from the fortress of Pine Ridge. Their first move was to seek out Inspector Franklin, the man Mason knew had been forced into retirement after questioning the official report on the Whispering Pines disaster. They found him living in a secluded cabin deep in the foothills, a man who had traded his inspector's badge for a paranoid's vigilance. The cabin was a hermit's den with windows boarded up and a complex system of tripwires and bells surrounding the perimeter. Franklin, a stooped man, with eyes that darted nervously, greeted Mason with a shotgun, and Abigail with deep suspicion. "Mercer." He rasped, his gaze fixing on her. "Have you lost your mind, Hayes, bringing the serpent's own daughter to my door?" "She's not like her father, Franklin," Mason said calmly. "She's here to help. She's been keeping her own records." It was Abigail's quiet determination that finally won the old inspector over. She spoke not of betraying her family, but of seeking the truth. "My father's name does not define my conscience, Mr. Franklin," she said. 12 men died, including Mr. Hayes' sister. Their memories deserve more than the official silence my family purchased. Franklin slowly lowered the shotgun. He led them inside, where maps and documents were piled high, a testament to 5 years of obsessive, solitary investigation. He confirmed Mason's suspicions the safety report had been altered. Critical violations concerning unstable support beams and poor ventilation had been systematically removed. The mine was a death trap. Franklin stated, his voice trembling with old anger. "I told them. I wrote it down. But Joseph Mercer has a long reach. My report was buried and I was offered a quiet retirement. It wasn't an offer." He gave them their next lead. The original land sale records in the county archive. Something was never right about how quickly the Buchanan widow sold the claim to Mercer. Look for the mineral rights addendum. That's where they hide the real value. Their next stop was the county records office in Laramie, a dusty repository of territorial history. Posing as a couple researching a new land purchase, they spent hours poring over ledgers and deeds. It was Abigail, with her experience in deciphering her father's contracts, who found the inconsistency. The sale price for the Whispering Pines claim was shockingly low, a pittance for such a large parcel, even with a collapsed mine on it. And as Franklin had suspected, the mineral rights clause was vague, referencing coal, but using language that obscured any other potential findings. Their investigation led them to Elias Thorne, the elderly and semi-retired editor of the Wyoming Sentinel. He was a man made of ink stains and cynicism, who had seen generations of ambition rise and fall in the territory. He remembered both the Hayes and the Mercer families well. "William Hayes was a good man," Thorne said, peering at Mason over his spectacles. "Honest. Too honest for a partner like Joseph Mercer, I always thought." The casual comment landed like a thunderclap. "Partner?" Mason asked, struggling to keep his voice even. "Oh, yes," Thorne said, leaning back in his creaky chair. "Years ago, before Mercer was Mercer, he and your father started out together, had a freight business, big plans. Then something happened, a falling out, a bad deal down in Cheyenne, I heard. Mercer lost everything. Blamed your father for it, though I never believed it. William wasn't the type. After that, Mercer became driven, rebuilt himself with a frightening intensity. Always seemed to me he wasn't just building a fortune, he was settling a score." As they worked together, sifting through Thorne's cryptic clues and the dry language of legal documents, the professional alliance between Mason and Abigail began to deepen into something more personal. In the evenings, by the light of a kerosene lamp at the ranch, they would share stories. Mason spoke of Rachel not as a victim, but as the vibrant, stubborn, and fiercely loyal sister she had been. He described her laugh, her terrible singing, her dream of starting a school for the ranch children in the valley. Truly talking about her for the first time in years, felt like letting air into a sealed room. Abigail, in turn, spoke of her own quiet prison. She described a childhood of lonely holidays, of a mother lost in a haze of social obligation, and a father who measured his children's worth in terms of their utility to his empire. She spoke of her grandmother, the woman who had secretly taught her to read ledgers and to value integrity over influence. "He never understood why I cared," she said one night, her gaze distant. "To him, compassion is a weakness to be exploited. He sees the world as a collection of assets and liabilities. I was always a liability." He was wrong. Mason said simply, his voice soft. "Your compassion is your strength. It's what makes you." He trailed off, unsure how to finish. The romantic tension between them was an unspoken current growing stronger with each shared discovery, each late-night conversation. It was in the way he would place a cup of coffee on the table beside her, without her having to ask, the way her hand would brush his as they both reached for the same document. And the long, quiet looks they exchanged when they thought the other wasn't watching. Their partnership, born of necessity and suspicion, was slowly, irrevocably transforming into a bond of mutual respect and the first tentative stirrings of affection. They were no longer just allies in a quest for justice. They were two lonely souls finding an unexpected sanctuary in each other's company. The midpoint twist, the revelation that would reshape their entire understanding of the tragedy, came not from a government office, but from a dusty, forgotten corner of the Mercer Mansion's library, acting on a cryptic hint from Elias Thorne about Mercer's wife keeping her own kind of ledgers. Abigail remembered a collection of old family albums and journals her mother Eleanor kept in a locked rosewood chest. She had described its location to Mason, and using a key from a similar piece of furniture at the ranch, he had slipped into the mansion one night while the family was attending a governor's ball. He found the chest hidden away in a small, unused reading nook. Inside, beneath layers of photographs and letters, was a slim leather-bound journal. It was Eleanor Mercer's private diary, its entries spanning 2 decades. Back at the ranch, under the stark light of a single lamp, they opened the journal. Eleanor's elegant script painted a portrait of a life lived in the shadow of a relentless ambition. But it was an entry from 15 years prior that made the air in the room grow cold. October 12, 1870. Joseph returned from Cheyenne, a broken man. The deal with William Hayes has fallen through, and we have lost everything. He paced the room all night like a caged wolf, repeating his name over and over. Hayes ruined me, he said. He humiliated me in front of the whole territory. He will pay for this. I will grind his name into the dust. I will take everything from him, just as he has taken everything from me. I have never seen such hatred in his eyes. It frightens me. They read on, piecing together the devastating narrative. Joseph Mercer had rebuilt his fortune with a single-minded, venomous purpose. His acquisition of businesses and land wasn't just ambition. It was a slow, methodical campaign against the memory of the man he blamed for his public failure. When he discovered the Whispering Pines mine owned by the heirs of a cousin of William Hayes, the opportunity for a final terrible revenge presented itself. A later entry dated just a week before the disaster confirmed their worst fears. April 10th, 1885. Jay spoke today of the Hayes girl, Rachel. He learned she is working at the Pine Ridge homestead, the last of William's direct line in this valley. He had the strangest look on his face, a look of terrible satisfaction. The final piece, he murmured. A legacy is not truly gone until the last heir is extinguished. I fear what he is planning at that mine. It is more than business. It is something dark and personal. The truth hit them with the force of a physical blow. The Whispering Pines disaster had never been about the gold. The gold was a convenient bonus, a way to finance the next stage of his empire. The true motive was a twisted 15-year-old vendetta. Joseph Mercer hadn't just allowed the disaster to happen through negligence. He had orchestrated it. He had intentionally destroyed the last vestige of the Hayes family legacy and murdered Mason's sister Rachel as the final cruel act in a long-simmering revenge plot. Mason stared at the journal, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. The grief he had carried for 5 years was suddenly dwarfed by a cold, white-hot rage. This wasn't a story of corporate greed. This was the story of a man so consumed by hatred that he would murder a young woman to settle a score with her long-dead father. Abigail watched him, her face pale, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. My father. She whispered the words, tasting like poison. He's a monster. The revelation transformed everything. They were no longer investigating a crime of negligence. They were confronting a calculated personal act of evil. Their fight was not just for justice anymore. It was a confrontation with a generational vendetta, a battle against a hatred so profound it had spanned decades and claimed innocent lives as its final prize. The weight of this new knowledge settled upon them, binding them together in a shared purpose that was now terrifyingly clear. Joseph Mercer was not a man who tolerated threats. The news that his enforcers had been turned away from Pine Ridge, coupled with reports from his informants in town about Mason and Abigail's inquiries, confirmed his suspicions. His daughter was not just a problem anymore. She was an active conspirator. He could no longer hide behind plausible deniability. It was time to eliminate the threat. The attack came without warning at dusk. Mason was in the barn finishing his evening chores when he heard the frantic barking of his dog, followed by a sudden, yelping silence. He emerged rifle in hand just in time to see 3 riders cresting the hill, their forms silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. They were not the clumsy enforcers from before. These men moved with a cold professional purpose. "Abigail," he yelled, running toward the house. "Get inside, bolt the door." He saw her face for a moment in the window, wide with alarm, before she disappeared. He took cover behind the water trough, the cool metal, a stark contrast to the heat rising in his chest. The riders split up, 2 circling to the back of the house, while the 3rd galloped straight for the barn, a lit torch in his hand. Mercer's plan was brutally simple: burn. Mason out destroy everything he had rebuilt and capture Abigail in the chaos. A bullet splintered the wood of the trough inches from Mason's head. He returned fire, his shot catching the lead rider's horse. The animal screamed and went down, pinning its rider beneath it. But the torch had already been thrown. It landed in the dry hay of the loft, which erupted in an explosion of orange flame. The heart of his ranch, the barn he had built with his own 2 hands, was burning. Rage and desperation warred within him, but he forced himself to focus. Abigail was the priority. He laid down, suppressing fire toward the 2 men now dismounted at the back of the house, giving him a moment to sprint to the front porch. The door was bolted. "Abigail, it's me, open it." The bolt slid back, and he tumbled inside, slamming the door shut just as a bullet tore through the wood. He found Abigail in the main room, a heavy cast-iron skillet held like a weapon, her face pale but resolute. "They're at the back," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "He sent them for you," Mason said, moving to the window. "And to destroy this." He looked around the simple, orderly home he had made, the books, the photograph of Rachel on the mantel, and knew he was about to lose it all. Another torch flew through the air, landing on the porch roof. Smoke began to seep through the walls. "We can't stay here," he said, grabbing her arm. "There's a root cellar. The entrance is under the rug in the kitchen. It has a tunnel that comes out by the creek bed. My father built it for emergencies." They scrambled into the kitchen just as the front windows shattered inward. Flames were already licking at the curtains. Mason threw the rug aside, revealing the heavy trap door. As he heaved it open, one of Mercer's men appeared in the kitchen doorway. Mason didn't hesitate. He fired from the hip. The man fell back with a cry. "Go," Mason urged, pushing Abigail toward the dark opening. She scrambled down the ladder without hesitation. Mason followed, pulling the heavy door shut above them, just as the kitchen floor began to groan under the fire's hungry assault. They navigated the narrow, dirt-walled tunnel by touch, the smell of smoke filling the air behind them. They emerged into the cool night air in the thicket of willows, by the creek, coughing and gasping. Behind them, Pine Ridge Ranch was a roaring inferno against the night sky. The house, the barn, 5 years of work, of building a life from the ashes of another tragedy, all of it was turning to ash itself. They watched in grim silence as the flames consumed Mason's world. The physical evidence they had gathered, Eleanor's journal, Abigail's copied notes, was gone, left behind in the burning house. All they had now was their knowledge, the key in Abigail's pocket, and a desperate resolve to survive. Headlights appeared in the distance, a wagon approaching. It was the 2 remaining men coming to search the creek bed for survivors. "We have to move," Mason whispered, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Now." They plunged into the icy water of the creek, using the current and the darkness to conceal their escape. For hours they moved through the wilderness, cold, exhausted, and hunted. They had survived, but just barely. They had lost their sanctuary, their evidence, their security. They were fugitives, with nothing left but the truth, a truth that at this moment seemed a very fragile weapon against the fire and fury of Joseph Mercer's power. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as dusk settled over the skeletal ruins of the Whispering Pines mine. Rain fell in cold, slanting sheets, turning the scorched earth to mud. Wind howled through the broken timbers of the mine entrance, a mournful cry that seemed to echo the tragedy that had happened there. This was the place Mason had chosen for the final confrontation. Abigail, her face streaked with grime and feigned tears, was shoved forward by one of her father's men. She stumbled to her knees in the mud before Joseph Mercer, who stood sheltered beneath a rocky overhang, his expression a mask of cold triumph. "You see, my dear daughter," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. "This is what happens when you choose sentiment over family. You ally yourself with a ghost and you end up in a graveyard." This was their desperate plan, conceived in the cold pre-dawn hours in an abandoned line shack. Abigail had allowed herself to be captured, sending a message to her father that she was broken ready to betray Mason in exchange for forgiveness. It was a terrible gamble, relying on her father's arrogance and his desire to see his enemy personally defeated. "He's coming for me." Abigail whispered, her voice a convincing imitation of fear. "He said he'd meet me here." "I know," Joseph smiled. "That is precisely the point." As if on cue, Mason's silhouette appeared on the ridge above them, starkly outlined by a sudden flash of lightning. He held his rifle loosely, his face a grim, unreadable mask. "Let her go, Mercer," he called down, his voice carrying over the storm. "Come down and get her, Hayes," Joseph taunted. "Come and face the man who erased your family name from this valley." Mason began to descend the unstable, muddy slope, moving with a deliberate, dangerous grace. Mercer's men raised their rifles, but Joseph held up a hand. "No, he is mine." The confrontation unfolded in the clearing before the collapsed mine, a tense standoff between two men representing generations of hatred. The ground was slick and treacherous, the air thick with rain and memory. "All of this," Mason said, gesturing to the ruins, "all those lives, for a business deal for a slight 15 years ago." "A slight?" Joseph laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your father didn't just cost me money, Hayes. He cost me my name. He made me a laughingstock. I spent 15 years rebuilding, and every brick I laid, every dollar I earned, was a promise to myself that I would one day pay him back. You and your sister were simply the final installment on that debt." As he spoke, another figure emerged from the shadows of the pines. It was Victoria. Her expensive traveling coat soaked her face, pale but resolute. "Father, stop this," she said, her voice clear and strong despite the storm. Joseph turned, his eyes widening in fury. "Victoria, what are you doing here? I told you to stay at the mansion." "I came to stop you from making another mistake," she said, stepping into the clearing. She looked at Mason. "The explosion, I helped arrange it. I wrote the letter. I paid the man. But he lied to me." Her gaze shifted back to her father. "You told me the mine would be empty. You swore to me no one would be hurt. You used my ambition, my desire to prove myself to you, to make me an accomplice to mass murder." The secondary twist landed with shattering force. Joseph's face contorted with rage. "You foolish girl, you would throw away everything for a moment of sentimental weakness." "There is nothing left to throw away," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "You built an empire of lies and blood. I will have no part of it." The moral stakes were now impossibly high, and Abigail was at their center. Abigail. Joseph commanded, his voice like cracking ice. His gun. Take it. Prove your loyalty to this family. Now. This was the moment of truth. Every eye was on her. She looked from her father's merciless face to Mason's, which was etched with pain, but also with a flicker of trust. She saw the ruins of the mine, a tomb for 12 souls, including the sister of the man, who had shown her more kindness in a week than her family had in a lifetime. Slowly, Abigail rose from the mud. She took a step toward Mason. Her hand reached out. For a heart-stopping second, Mason thought their gamble had failed. Then, instead of reaching for his gun, her hand closed around his. She turned to face her father, standing united with Mason. "No," she said, her voice ringing with newfound power. "My loyalty is to the truth. It's over, Father." Joseph Mercer's face became a mask of pure fury. He drew a pistol from his coat. "Then you will die with him." The world exploded into action. Mason pushed Abigail behind him as he fired his Colt. One of Mercer's men went down. Victoria screamed. Joseph's pistol cracked, and a searing pain shot through Mason's left arm. He staggered, but kept his feet firing again. The gunfight was brutal and short. When the echoes faded, Mercer's men were both wounded, and Joseph himself was on the ground, clutching a bleeding leg, his face a mask of disbelief. Mason stood over him, his Colt steady the rain, washing the blood from his wounded arm down his sleeve. The climax was over. Joseph Mercer was not dead, but subdued his empire of lies, collapsing around him in the mud and the rain at the very site of his most monstrous crime. The wail of the storm was soon joined by another sound, the thunder of approaching horses. Just as Mason had arranged, the territorial marshal, summoned by a message sent with a trusted ranch hand before they left for the mine, arrived with a posse of deputies. They took in the scene the wounded men, the defiant women, Mason standing sentinel over the fallen Joseph Mercer, and moved in to secure the area. As the marshal was placing Joseph Mercer in irons, another carriage appeared, its wheels churning through the mud. Eleanor Mercer stepped out, holding a lantern against the gloom. She carried a heavy leather satchel. Her face was calm, her gaze unwavering, as she looked at her husband not with hatred, but with a profound and sorrowful finality. "I believe this will be of interest to you, Marshal," she said, her voice steady. She opened the satchel, revealing ledgers and financial records. "These are my husband's private accounts. They will show the payments made before the disaster, the transfer of funds to conceal the gold survey, and the shamefully small settlements paid to the victims' families. They will prove beyond any doubt that the Whispering Pines disaster was a premeditated act of revenge." Her words were the final damning evidence. Joseph Mercer stared at his wife, his expression of rage collapsing into one of utter defeat. He had underestimated her, just as he had underestimated Abigail, and in the end, it was the quiet, unseen women of his own family who had engineered his downfall. Victoria, her face pale, stepped forward. "I will testify, Marshal," she said. "I will tell you everything my father did, everything he made me do. In exchange, I ask only for leniency." The marshal nodded curtly. Victoria then turned to Abigail, a look of complex sorrow passing between the sisters. "I am leaving for San Francisco in the morning. I don't suppose I will ever see you again." With a final haunted look at the mine, she allowed a deputy to escort her to a separate wagon. Her ties to the Mercer family and to Wyoming were severed forever. The marshal approached Mason. "You've got a nasty wound there, Hayes. You and the ladies should get somewhere warm and dry." Mason nodded, his body finally succumbing to the exhaustion and the pain in his arm. He and Abigail, emotionally and physically spent, were helped back to the main road. They didn't return to the charred ruins of Pine Ridge. Instead, they took shelter at the home of the marshal's doctor in town. In the quiet of a small, clean room, as the doctor stitched and bandaged Mason's arm, they finally had a moment alone. They didn't speak. There were no words for the cataclysm they had survived. Abigail gently cleaned the grime from Mason's face with a damp cloth, her touch more comforting than any words could be. He reached up with his good hand and covered hers, a silent acknowledgement of all they had endured and all they had become to each other. Their long fight was over. The process of healing was just beginning. Months later, the Wyoming sun shone down on a scene of rebirth. The sounds of hammers and saws echoed through the valley where Pine Ridge Ranch stood. With the help of neighbors from Silver Creek, who now knew the full story of his quiet heroism, Mason was rebuilding. The new barn was already framed larger and stronger than the first. The foundation for the new house had been laid. The town, once suspicious of the reclusive rancher, now treated him with a quiet, profound respect. Joseph Mercer had been tried and found guilty. Eleanor's ledgers and Victoria's testimony had been undeniable. He was serving a life sentence in the territorial prison his empire dismantled his name, now a synonym for monstrous greed and vengeful cruelty. The final scene of their long drama took place not in a courtroom or a ruined ranch, but in the small, quiet graveyard where Rachel Hayes rested. Mason and Abigail stood before the simple headstone, the grass around it green and vibrant. The air was clean, filled with the scent of pine and the promise of a new season. Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver pocket watch, the object that had restarted his quest, the symbol of the past that had held him captive for so long. For a moment, he held it, the silver warm from his touch. Abigail watched him, her expression soft and understanding. This was a final goodbye he had to make alone. But the final surprise was not one of sorrow. Mason was not there to mourn, but to let go. He did not open the watch to look at his father's inscription one last time. Instead, he gently placed it on the granite headstone, its silver gleaming in the sun. It was a symbolic offering, the end of his obsession, the final release of his vow of vengeance. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost. He turned to Abigail, and the haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for 5 years was gone, replaced by a clear, steady light. He was no longer Mason Hayes the Avenger. He was Mason Hayes, the man who had survived, the man who was ready to build a new life. He held out his hand. She took it without hesitation, her fingers lacing with his. They stood for a moment longer, not looking at the grave, but at each other, their shared future stretching before them, as wide and promising as the Wyoming sky. Then together, they turned and walked away from the grave, hand in hand toward their home, which was rising from the ashes and a life they would build together.